Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Cheryl Fogle Hatch. She graduated from the University of New Mexico with a master's and PhD in anthropology, and from the University of Arizona with a bachelor's in journalism. She is the founder of MuseumSense, LLC, a business that develops multisensory experiences in galleries, museums, and other organizations. How are you doing today, Cheryl?
Good.
Great. So, what is an accessibility researcher and consultant, and why are they important?
Well, the roles are a little bit different. Some people are consultants, and so they might learn what the best practices are and help people try to apply them. And some people, like myself and some others I know, do research, and we do some consulting. We know what the best practices are, but we try to push the envelope a little bit. So I have interest in design of effective tactile media. How can you design something that contains information by touch and that you can explore by touch and get information by touch? And so I go through and I know the guidelines, but I also know where there are gaps. It's kind of like doing academic research, but there's an applied component. So it'd be like some of the different applied fields. Although all of your applied anthropology interviewers are probably going to come back and say, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm an archaeologist. So there you go.
Okay. And so, what does your day-to-day look like as an accessibility researcher?
Oh, it varies. My project today was grant writing because I'm trying to get an exhibition up at a local museum, and so I need the money to plan it. And so that's more consulting work than research work because I'm basically applying for funds to start the process of curating. So going to local artists and seeing who works in sculpture and mixed media and fiber and who's comfortable with their work being touched or comfortable creating work that would be touched, because this will be a project that may open next fall. So we've got some time yet. So today I was administrative. I was doing grant writing. Yesterday I was participating in a research study with, in this case, I was actually providing feedback on someone else's prototype on something. I happen to be totally blind, and so I'm sometimes asked to participate in other people's studies and give feedback. And I'm also sometimes conducting my own studies and receiving feedback. I'd say probably, and then other days I do literature review. I have to read into other fields. I have to be pretty interdisciplinary. I have to read into art. I have to read into design and do all sorts of things that are other than the anthropology degree that I have. So I'm using those skills all the time. I guess I don't really have a typical day to day. Some days all I am doing is on Zoom calls like everybody else.
Yeah. So you had mentioned that you're totally blind. And how do you navigate, because everything is so technology-based these days, what kind of technology do you use to help, read through documents or, grant requirements, that kind of stuff?
I use a screen reader on my computer. That's voice output, and they have them on phones now. So if you go into accessibility settings on your phone, most smartphones now, you can find something it might say something for vision, and you'd have abilities to magnify your screen, but you'd also have on the iPhone, it's called VoiceOver. You can turn it on and have it speak. Android has TalkBack, and Windows has narrator. So there are different synthetic speeches, and the voices have gotten a lot better and a lot more varied. I also use a refreshable Braille display that I connect to my computer, and I can read in Braille the same thing that's being spoken on the screen, because the Braille kind of uses the screen reader in the same way, just to get Braille instead of speech. That means that materials have to be designed properly. You can't send me an image, because a screen reader can't interact with images. So that's why there's practices for web design and document design that you have to assign text labels to all your images, so a screen reader can identify a button that's labeled properly and as an edit box or a submit button or a combo box. And I often will have to report to somebody that there's a glitch on a particular site and they can't do something. And in certain cases, I use certain services that I connect someone to my machine remotely to go in and do all the things that require a mouse, because I'm navigating with a keyboard only. I'm not using a mouse.
Right.
If Excite isn't keyboard navigational, then I'll have to come up with some other way of. So there is a little bit of workarounds, and it really depends on what I'm doing, how much help I need, workarounds.
Right. And so being blind, did that kind of, I don't want to say pique your interest, but was that kind of a reason on why you created MuseumSense so that other individuals who may be blind or have vision impairments could experience museums and galleries, in the same way that seeing individuals could as well?
Yes, I have the lived experience of knowing when I can access something and when I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I came into museums through my research in archaeology, so I was in the labs and in the collection spaces and just blown away because you could open drawers and open boxes and open bags and handle artifacts, and you get to front of house and it's all in display cases.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I really truly realized how much stuff museums hold until I got into those behind the scenes spaces and collection spaces. So that was my original intent as I got my degree and did my research in collections, that I was going to go into, registrar or curation or some of those roles. It's just that because I have lived experience as a blind person, because I can articulate what I need and what works and what doesn't, one or two people started asking me for, advice, and then somebody offered me a stipend, and then somebody else said, why don't you form a business? And then I was just starting to get going, and then COVID hit. So I was home, and I had time to put my website up and start doing business planning and launch. And when we did that pivot to virtual, I was dealing with all the accessibility things and trying to get organized for in-person. So yes, they are pretty inseparable. When I write grant applications, I'll say I have research experience and lived experience that work at the intersection of those two.
Wow, that's amazing. It's something that a lot of people who may not have like a disability or an impairment might not understand just the gravity of like the work that you're doing of, oh, well, why do we need things that can be touched in museums? Because a lot of places, like there was this one news report about how I think it was like a 3 or 4-year-old had pulled down the vase because they're like, oh, we believe in, not casing our artifacts and whatnot. And, it's been up in the museum for years, and this is the first time this has ever happened. But I guess individuals, like, they don't really understand that, like, if something is cased, unless someone is with that individual, there's no way for them to know what's behind the case unless they have something in Braille or like some exhibits where they have headphones where you can listen to kind of like the story and the history and describing the artwork. So I think that's super cool that you're doing something like this and trying to, hopefully this gets into all museums because, museums are a place for learning. And if you're only catering to one type of individual, are you really doing your job as a museum and educating the public?
Yeah. And there's research out there that people benefit from multisensory experiences. Even if you can look at an object, if you can touch something that's a representative of it or touch the original object, that's beneficial. And there are balancing acts between, preservation of artifacts. And some things, if something's several thousand years old, keep it behind glass and put some kind of reproduction or something else in front. I have respect for artifacts being in archaeology and it's basically a different way of looking at objects. A lot of archaeologists end up in museums because either we've done the research in museum collections or we just have an affinity for objects and what stories you can tell with objects, because that's so much what archaeology is. You're telling a story from what you find and where you find it. In museum world, you're going the opposite way. You're telling a story, particular exhibit content, particular time in history, or a particular kind of art or something, and you're finding objects to represent the story.
Right.
So I'm really interested in kind of playing with how do you know what you know? In fields that deal with objects, is how do you know what the story is behind this object? So anytime I find research about any kind of object handling or any kind of benefits, for everybody, because that's the selling point, because benefits for me, but there's also benefits for you for having something in multi-sensory way, displaying information in more than one mode, having something you can read, having something you can listen to, having something you can touch, having something you can see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because not everyone learns the same way.
Exactly.
Like there's a museum in Houston, I think it's one of their natural museums, where they have like a replication of Lucy and her bones, and they actually have some that were, I believe, 3D printed that are outside of the glass as well. So you can kind of feel like the shape of them and how big they are. So I thought that was like a really cool thing because not many people realize you can look at something all you want, but if you can't know its story by like feeling what they felt or eating or touching that kind of stuff, you might not get the full story of, who this individual was, how they lived back then. And I think that's great with archaeology, and I feel like archaeologists are super lucky individuals because they're touching items that haven't been touched in, hundreds or thousands of millions of years. You're just holding a piece of history, and I think that's so cool. With the research that you do and like the exhibits that you have, how do you incorporate user feedback into your research to make the exhibitions or exhibits better?
Well, at the moment, I have an exhibit up, which is, it's got 3D prints of mastodon fossils, which is elephants, extinct elephants. There's a local museum in Baltimore, and there's a story about how the American Revolution, the founding fathers during the American Revolution were really interested in our fossils because some of the European scientists thought that animals got weaker and went extinct in the Americas. And they were saying, no, they don't get weaker and smaller. We have big skeletons too. And so that has both paleontology and history, and I've been receiving feedback. We will probably redesign parts of it and keep it up. So right now, the feedback I'm getting is anecdotal. I've had a couple of good friends of mine go through, and they've said, oh, we like that you have Braille labels, but could you move them so that I'm reading on an angle and not vertically up and down the pedestal? And that happened because I made the Braille labels for my own exhibit. I went through with the staff person and we marked which way was up because I didn't want her putting them in upside down. Right. But I forgot to ask her to put them on an angle. So we need to redo that. And she knows that. And we just need to do that. So a lot of times feedback is anecdotal. So you could design a study, like if I chose to do something and have like 10 people come in and ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, how did you like the placement of XYZ label? Right. That's one way to do it. But in practice, unless you set it up that way and then take it down, if you have an exhibit up for a period of a couple months, you're more likely to get those kind of anecdotal. Oh, I was here. I toured the exhibit before a program, and this is what I remember, and this is what I want to tell you. And that's fine too. That's, a lot of visitor studies evaluations can be very informal for general audiences. So no reason why we can't have our own informal ones as well.
Right, exactly. And so for a lot of your exhibits or the modifications that you make that make it more accessible to individuals, you had mentioned like talking to individuals who do like sculptures, and you mentioned that you use 3D printing. Are there other methods that you use other than those two?
I usually find the vendors to create the objects. I don't do my own. I've thought about that going into design, and I still might down the line. But right now, what I say is that I help museums evaluate the quality of touch objects. I have a friend who does wax molds, and he created some maps by using a wax mold and then casting it. And I think it's powdered mica is that makes the lines. So it's very colorful. It's kind of shiny in places. So the lines, you can tell where the lines are visually as well as tactilely. So he put together wax molds and did his that way. I have another friend and colleague who is working on a new technique to use digital embroidery and put thread on cardstock and stitch items. And she started that to make replicas of sailors' patches on the Intrepid Museum. That's a decommissioned aircraft carrier. And so the collection has all these historic naval sailors' patches. And you can't touch them. They're fragile, and so they're behind glass. But she got the idea to use thread because that mimics the aesthetics of the patch, because they were using thread. And she uses the digital embroidery, uses like CAD files, just like 3D printing would, or 3D modeling before you get to the 3D printing, which is a different animal. But she has developed a technique that she can use and create files and stitch different designs that way. So this is very new. She last year worked with a couple of students, so she was able to teach students. So we now know that the technique is reproducible. We just need to do some more work and kind of get some standards and get that more into general circulation. But all of us involved in that project are big fans of having a tactile that has as much as you can, a similar material to the original. It just enhances it. There's times you can't do that. I always give the example of the Smithsonian American History Museum because they have thousands upon thousands of visitors. And in their new Entertainment Nation gallery, they have a bronze representation of the ruby slipper in The Wizard of Oz. And it has to be bronze. Cloth would not withstand being in such a high traffic area. Right. But they put, you can feel the outlines and the buckles and the things like that. You can feel the features. They cast it in solid bronze. And you just have to just realize that meets their use case. But in, a lower traffic area, why not, design a shoe? Mm-hmm. And I think there's other techniques borrowed from education where you can make tactile graphics by using, basically it's carbon ink and paper. It's like capsules of carbon ink. And when you heat it, the ink breaks the capsules open and it raises the lines. It's called swell form. And that's a technique that is used a lot in education. And it works for kinds of classroom handouts and things like that. It's okay in museum programs, but after a while it gets kind of mushed and handled by the paper. And it's also, everything feels exactly the same. You get the shape, you get the features and the outline. But my friend who's working in digital embroidery used a swell form to make replicas of the same patches that she stitched. And several of us, blind and sighted, said the embroidery feels clearer, the lines are clearer with the thread. The swell form feels a little bit more mushy. It gives you the same outline and some of the features, but it's just a different feel aesthetically. So we've been calling it, you want a good tactile media, either a raised line graphic or a model, 3D model, ideally would have both information about the object it represents and be aesthetically similar. That's not always the case, but in an ideal circumstance.
Right. So do you have, I don't want to call them partnerships, but you said you have vendors. So you reach out to these individuals and you're like, hey, would you be comfortable making X, Y, and Z, that kind of stuff? Is this something that like your grants would then pay out to them? Or is it kind of like, hey, would you be willing to do this as a favor of the museum kind of thing? Like your art will be shown. Yeah.
The grant that I'm working on now, we will fundraise to give artists a stipend to work on new work. At other times, I've reached out to established vendors and said, what would a quote be if a museum paid for this component to be tactile object? I mean, museums have exhibit design funds and they pay for the visual stuff and the interactive and the digital. And sometimes they will pay for tactile. And there are a few larger vendors, but there really needs to be an ecosystem of makers and artists and commission-based stuff for the smaller institutions that don't have the big research design budgets or that have to apply for grants to fund every exhibit they redesign. So yeah, it is kind of case by case, depending on how a project's funded. But I do, if I'm not paying directly, I try to get a mechanism together where they're contracting with the museum to purchase the item.
Okay, that's really cool. Other than your lived experience, what led you to this career path? Like, what led you to archaeology?
Interest. I did my undergrad in journalism, and I was getting into my junior year, and I had to take electives. I just took American archaeology or something. It wasn't even the right sequence. It was like a 200 level, and I should have taken the 101. And it's like, oh, this is a convenient time. It's a little early, but it's convenient for me. It was an 8 a.m. class, and I thought, well, this might be interesting. I used to like reading, National Geographic and doing other kinds of things. And I also took my science requirement. I took a geology class. And for a couple of months, I couldn't decide between archaeology and geology. They're both cool, but the humans won out. But I took that 8 a.m. archaeology class, and I always arrived early. And the other days of the week, my 9:30 reporting public affairs class, I barely could arrive early to. So I was like, okay, this is clearly something I'm more interested in. But at that point, I only had a couple more classes on my journalism degree, so I finished it. I just did my senior year. It's like, all right, I want to apply to grad school in archaeology. So my senior year, I actually took my 101 and 102 courses As a senior, I'm like, yeah, the 4 fields of anthropology. And then I didn't get into grad school right away, so I took a year non-degree and took the rest of basically the core for an anthropology major and applied for grad school again. But yeah, I really pursued interest. And then it's like, what can keep and hold my interest? And archaeology and anthropology can keep it and hold it much better than the major I was signed up for.
Correct.
But I don't regret it. The journalism, I've got interview skills. Can make cold calls. The writing skills, I write a blog, and that's not quite journalistic, but it's definitely shorter sentence structure than academia and a little bit more informal. Microsoft always flags when I'm spell checking a blog entry before I post it. Microsoft always flags me for informal writing. It's like, yeah, I know. So there's things from the journalism degree I use all the time, especially now. Not for a while, but now that I'm writing at so many different levels and having to constantly call people and talk to people about different fields. Like, I work primarily with history museums right now. I'd like to work more with science museums, but just my networking is stronger in, historic sites. And so those are the people that will refer me to their friends. But if anyone's listening from the Maryland Science Center, give me a call.
Yeah. I feel like anthropology is something like a lot of people, they don't know it exists, and then they're in college and they have to take a humanities course, and they're like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And they're like, oh my God, this is cooler than what I'm actually getting my degree. Because that's how I felt. I have a degree in business, and I'm like, these classes are so boring and mind-numbing. And then I had an introduction to anthropology class. I'm like, this is much more interesting. Like, I'll come to this class instead.
I can't even imagine a degree in business. I had to take a business planning course for a particular state grant that I got to support my business expenses as I was getting started. And oh my God, that was like pulling nails.
Oh, yes. Especially, oh man, I had one semester. It was all because I was doing my anthropology and business degree at the same time. But because I'd come in with credits from high school, it wasn't going to take me more time to finish the 2 degrees. So I was still going to graduate within the 4 years. But I think one semester I only had all business classes. And the way I set up my classes is I'm like, I only want to go to class 2 times a week. So they were either Monday, Wednesday classes, or they were Tuesday, Thursday classes. So I'd have 4 classes in one day, which would suck during exam season because I'd have, that was a nightmare. But I had one class, it was an accounting class, and it was from 6 to 8:30, and it was once a week, and it was the last class of the week, and I'm like, I can't be in here any longer. It was so bad, but yeah, I think that's the great thing about anthropology is it piques almost most people's interest. They're like, wow, this is really cool. I'd love to learn more about this, or I'll just watch documentaries or go to museums on the side instead of getting a degree in it. But talking about getting a degree in it, when you went to go get your master's and PhD in anthropology, what was that experience like for you? And is there any advice you can give to individuals who might be looking to go into grad school?
Well, for me, it took me a little while to find a program, but because I did that, it took me a couple of years, a couple cycles through. The second time, I was much more careful about reading all the requirements and looking stuff up. But I still say, if you get a chance to visit a campus or a program, do it. Just see how people treat each other and just what people talk about. I did a field school right before I started, and I got some tips from the field school TAs about the program because I was starting in the fall. But because I came into anthropology so late, I didn't have a field school with my a bachelor's. So I took a field school and I got tips about this professor likes this one. This professor doesn't like this one. This professor's professional to work with. All those kinds of interpersonal relationships, because what somebody studies academically and what the research focus is important, but equally important, you don't want to be working with a first-class jerk if you don't have to.
Right.
That kind of intel. And I learned later on in my career that chances are, if more than one student had a problem with someone, it probably wasn't the student. And just mind those interpersonal relations. Oh, and advice I was given, much earlier in life as I was starting college. Someone told me, I always make friends with the admin people and the security guards. They know stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They know, who's not in or who do you see about XYZ university process. The faculty may know, but you can pretty much guarantee that the secretaries and the admin and the office managers will know. And it doesn't hurt to be kind to the cleaning staff too and say, excuse me, when you're walking around them, or hello. Just people's academic credentials matter, people's research ethics matter, but it really is key to be a genuinely good human person.
Right.
We have to make it in this world, and so much about life is interpersonal relationships and study and work. And I'm kind of broad brush strokes, but I so often have conversations with students, because either they're finishing up their research or they're conducting research. The skills you gain, how to collect information, how to read and summarize a paper, how to figure out what the most important points are, how to evaluate data and look at someone's claims. Those process skills are going to serve you whatever you apply them to. Really don't scrimp on figuring out how to be a good researcher, because even if, I haven't looked at the stone spear points that I did my research on, and I haven't even opened my dissertation files in a few years. I'm not likely to at this point, but it doesn't matter. I have that skill set. I gained that skill set. And the research is out there should someone decide to build on it. Or if I should ever decide to revisit it or get more involved in the academic side of anthropology and archaeology anymore. But it's really going to grad school is you're getting your toolkit together for anything you might do post-grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So concentrate on your skills and on your hard skills, your soft skills, and all of that, and you're making an investment in you. And it does matter what your research product is. It matters what your dissertation or your thesis is. But I think it matters more so how you come out of the experience.
Yeah, no, definitely. You have a lot of individuals who come out with their master's and PhD, but they haven't really learned anything, whether it's things that are going on in the world or how to interact with people, because people and networking is most of the times how you're going to get to where you want to get to, especially in the field of anthropology. Everyone almost knows everyone. So how you treat your classmates or your professors, these are going to be your colleagues one day or someone you might need some help from. So it bids you well to treat people with respect and kindness.
Speaking of everyone knowing everyone, I've recognized your last couple of episodes.
That's awesome. Yeah,
AAA folks.
Yes, they were great individuals to speak with. I feel like it's also important to be involved in those kind of organizations like American Anthropological Association or like the Society for Applied Anthropology, that kind of stuff, because that's how I find most of the individuals that I'm interviewing is through these organizations. And I'm so grateful that all of you have been so nice in wanting to talk to me. Yeah, so networking is key.
Start somewhere.
Exactly. So do you feel that obtaining an anthropology degree has kind of broadened your view on the world?
Oh, absolutely. Because when I was teaching, I've taught 101 and the Anthro 101, and I've also taught, some of the archaeology coursework. And with Anthropology 101, anthropology is the study of everything. It's humans, it's everything. You even touch on it when you do your first archaeology course, because, okay, what's archaeology? It's a subfield of anthropology. What's anthropology? The study of humans, the study of everything. So everything I can touch on involves anthropology somehow.
Right.
Whether it's history and how to get a historic site to really level up their game, that's organizational culture, that's anthropology. Or whether it's trying to convince a sculptor that it's okay if they just add a more secure base to their sculpture and let people touch it. That's anthropology, because you're dealing with their conception of art. There's a whole field of sensory anthropology that I'm intending to explore when I have some time that is completely new to me. There's a whole field of visual anthropology, like media and photographs, which I didn't know. So then I was asking on a particular listserv about anthropology for if there's exploration of audio and tactile, and I'm not sure yet, but there's work on what people are calling sensory anthropology. So if I can manage to get myself a research grant to support some deep background research, I'll get into that. I would like to research a book on tactile design, and it will touch on some of that because I want to talk about visual and tactile perception because they are different. There's just vision and hearing, you can be at a distance. Tactile, you have to be at arm's length or no further because you can't touch it otherwise. So the scale shifts, and the scale of the finger, most of the guidelines for designing tactile media say that you should have about 1/8 of an inch between points and 1/4 of an inch for each line. And that's, a finger's width or 2 fingers width. Tactile perception is conditioned by the human hand and the human arm. And there's some people in psychology who study these things. And I need to really dig into it to really be able to make some strong recommendations about tactile design. Because right now, a lot of the museum guidelines say you should have them. But then people, how do you make them? And well, you contact this company. Or well, they Google and they get the Braille Authority of North America, the guidelines for how you put tactile graphics in a Braille textbook. It's not exactly what museums need, and people don't translate that. This book that I wrote a grant for, if I ever get the research money to do it, I want to go through tactile perception and design recommendations and some recent research on how people use tactile perception for spatial thinking. Because so much of the psychology research on spatial thinking is visual, and all of the tests on how you guesstimate relationships and lengths of items is visual. There was a recent project that was funded about blind people in engineering drawings. They're trying to figure out what drawing standards could be that are tactile and how people think tactily for the different lines and things like that. And I need to dig into that research in order to put something really good and high quality out there with recommendations. It's something more than just look at these guidelines. And There's always going to be a place for look at these guidelines. But that's why I say I'm a researcher, because I really want to build and add to instead of just saying, well, this is what's established. But it also means that it's harder to fund. And I spend a good chunk of my time grant writing instead of I have friends or consultants who they respond to proposals and they give museums what they want. And sometimes it's how do you write an audio script? And that's important too. But if I can build more robust ecosystem around tactile design, and I'm not the only one doing it, I've got colleagues. But I have colleagues in human-computer interaction because of, refreshable braille displays and haptics. I've got a colleague who just is working for industrial design school. That's where she landed a job. So I've got people in multiple disciplines. I talk to people in other disciplines other than anthropology all the time. And I need to have that perspective of being able to read my way into their field, or at least enough to kind of recognize the big names and to recognize when I have a concept and when I need to go to a specialist. In anthropology, because it's the study of humans, I think we're uniquely suited for that. And other people just can't get outside of their niche as easily as we can.
Definitely agree. Is there anything that we haven't discussed today that you would like the listeners to know about?
My gosh, think outside the box. If you have a skill set that can fill a particular need, try to fill it. And maybe you're talking to a community, determining a need, build that skill set to really create things. I think we get into, sometimes with academics, the literature says this and this and this. Well, yes, but it doesn't say that. But is it because someone studied it? Or is it because nobody's thought to study it? I run into that a lot because not as many people study tactile perception as study visual perception. And it's just one of those things that I have to understand that, I'm working with humans and, there's going to be gaps. And just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean I can't create it to exist. So I think, we as anthropologists, because we had that broad interdisciplinary perspective, can really make some contributions there.
Our main goal is to change the world.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So into our final 4 questions, and it's the questions that I ask everybody. What is the biggest piece of advice that you would offer to someone who was interested in getting into multisensory development or research?
I would say talk to all kinds of people. Get to know people with different sensory disabilities. Go to public events, that are put on and advertised to the public by the different advocacy organizations. The National Federation of the Blind will sometimes have tables. They'll be at fairs, resource fairs, sometimes at tables. There's other organizations. The American Council of the Blind does it too. Meet people as people. For me, I occasionally have a chance to interact with deaf people, but I'm usually texting because I need screen output, for voice output, and they need to be able to read. So sometimes communication has to be more creative, but be open to exploring. If you really want to learn about deaf culture, take a ASL course, at your college. If you want to do work with a particular population, make friends of people in that population. Doesn't mean that because you meet one person, you know everybody's story, but it makes someone, you can think, this is my friend. This is how she does this. It's not just, they do that differently. Try to meet people so you're not othering. And I guess it's how some ethnographers will go away and live with a community for some period of time. And there are people who get done ethnography and disability. It's not my particular research method, just because, I guess you could say if I write an essay and talk about my lived experience, it could be autoethnography, but I wouldn't go that far because I would have to look up what autoethnography is again before I throw around the jargon. But yeah, I would say get to know people. Read, if you can't get to know people, watch stuff on YouTube and read blogs, but realize that you're getting media that may or may not, you'll check the sources of your media and realize it's media, and there's never going to be a shortcut for meeting people. There's a professor at one of our universities, and he teaches classes in accessibility and digital media, and he gives his students an assignment, his intro students, an assignment. He recruits among blind people he knows with the National Federation of the Blind chapter. And he'll say to us, is anyone free this week to meet with my students and chat with my students? And then he gives them, questions and prompts and things like that. But they have to meet with you and they have to sit and talk to you for an hour. And then they write something up for him. But I did this once or twice, and, we met at a coffee shop and talked about stuff in their class and this, that, and the other. And just to get beyond the, they do this or we do that, and we need to help them by doing this, just to humanize. And it's a drop in the bucket, but you always hope that something like that would plant a seed. I have no idea what the particular student I met with is doing now. But it could be something he'd say 5 years down the line, I talked to somebody about that. And so, I get to know people as people and realize that I'm blind and I do something one way, but someone else is blind might do something a different way. And preferences, abilities, experiences vary, and get to know people as people.
Right.
Now that I've repeated myself.
No, it's a very powerful quote. The only way to destigmatize anything is to learn more about it, meet the individuals. Otherwise, it's always going to be something of a, oh no, I don't know how to interact with this person. I don't want to offend them. And it's just no, just they are human beings. Just meet with them. You might just have to adjust, whatever it is, the mode of language or whatnot, communication might have to adjust, but we're all human beings.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what changes do you wish to see in the industry you work in?
I really wish people would start shifting their organizational culture and their funding models, because right now museums are in a scarcity mindset. We don't have the money to do this, or we can't do this, or if we had funding, we would do. And every presentation that I've been to on accessibility, it's, we don't have the funding to do this. Well, do you have the funding to talk to people, and maybe can you do this thing instead? And the advice that colleagues I respect always give is meet people, start somewhere, and be transparent about what you haven't done. If you don't have a historic site that has steps up somewhere, if the accessible route is you go into the modern building and take an elevator and go here and turn there, put that on your map so that people know. They don't just see the front steps and go, I can't come in with a wheelchair. So there needs to be more transparency, which means organizations have to admit that there are things that are not perfect. And some organizations have trouble with that. So that's one thing. And people to be more adventurous and problem solve and prototype and realize that if something doesn't work, you can change it. But accessibility is very much one of these things where the perfect is the enemy of the good. There's so many things to do. We can't do all of them, so we're not going to start with any of them. Some organizations do that. And you have a conversation with somebody, and then 5 years later, you meet somebody else who's working for the same organization. You have exactly the same conversation. I've been in rooms like that. It's like, did you know so-and-so? No. Well, did you know so-and-so? No. Well, they told us about this, and they said exactly the same thing for exactly the same reasons, and that was 5 years ago. It's organizational culture. You can solve technology, you can solve funding. It takes work. You can solve many, many other practices, but if you can't be flexible with your organizational culture, and that comes from the top. And if people at the top aren't open to change and experimentation and prototyping, yeah, something's going to be the same 20 years from now. I keep getting longer in my time frames, but yeah, it happens.
Yeah. And it's definitely, and I don't know how it is in other countries, but, here being like the goal for most places is profit, and any kind of change, there's uncertainties and there's, things that they can't think of that might influence what's going to happen. So they're like, if this business model works, what's the point in changing it?
Yeah.
So yes, that is a very big problem. But to get out of the not so depressing, but depressing, what do you just absolutely love about what you do?
I love being able to take a project from concept to exhibit installation. That was a lot of fun. My current exhibit that's up now, it took about 1.5 years of fairly solid work. Now, some of it was fundraising, but then when my co-curator got the funds to start 3D printing the objects, and then we got to start talking about design and what went where in the gallery and where to put the labels and how the traffic was going to flow. It's a lot of moving pieces. But then you get to the grand opening and, you're open and people are going through it. And then they're going out to the reception in the lobby and having a glass of wine with you and saying what they liked. It's like, oh, wow. Or when I can bring friends of mine into my exhibit and here is a scale model of mastodon, which is a couple feet, and then walk across the room and say, this is a life-size 3D print of a tusk, which by itself is 3 feet, and say, now do you understand why we don't have the mastodon at life size? It would fill up the whole room. And they've walked the space, they've touched the scale model, so they know the size of the animal relative, the tusk, the feet, the tail. Mm-hmm. And I've taken them across for the life-size tusk, and they put those two pieces together, and the light bulb just, oh, wow, that's big. Like, yeah, that's big. Because this is a small room, and the tusk we had to mount the tusk on its side facing up vertically against a wall, because we talked about mounting it out horizontally, and the consensus was that if we did that, you wouldn't have any room to move around it. And I usually tell people that once they've touched the bottom of the tusk and the top of the tusk. If we put it horizontally, it'd come all the way to the scale model, that pedestal. If we had a full life-size 3D print of a mastodon, it'd fill up the whole room, and we'd have room for any of the rest of the exhibit. So that's right now, that's a lot of fun when I get a chance to give tours and show people that wow moment.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, our final question, where can listeners learn more about you and what you do?
MuseumSenses.org is the best place. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. I try to post since I have a blog entry, I try to post to LinkedIn. And occasionally I thought we'll make it on LinkedIn that's not juicy enough for a blog. When I started my website, I wrote my blog a lot more frequently, but I'm not so much anymore because I'm doing so much client work that I only want to put general resources on my blog or general thoughts. So I do put stuff up there, but it's only, it's every couple of months or so instead of what I was doing was, monthly. But there's still a lot of good resources there. If you follow the tags for Braille or 3D printing, you can go back in my archive and find a lot of the links that I compiled for people and about process stuff, about audio description and about 3D printing and things like that. And every so often I'll post on my LinkedIn feed some of my better resource posts from older, because people haven't seen them or they need to see them now and they didn't 4 years ago. So those are the two best things to do. I'm a one-person shop, so I can't be on all the social medias. Now, maybe one of my clients will put something of mine on their Facebook or Instagram. You might find me, but you probably won't be able to interact with me on those platforms. So my website or LinkedIn.
Okay, perfect. Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on my podcast and taking the time to talk about this with me.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Awesome. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to another episode of Anthropuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website and episode descriptions, and to Leah Akers for the incredible logo design. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound of Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzle.com. That's abby.letzinger@anthropuzzle.com. Or as Anthropuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, or YouTube. Until next time.